The authors of your textbook make that distinction. Anybody remember? Authorization bill and appropriations bill. Anybody remember? Are you guys just guessing on those reading quizzes? Is that why we're not getting 100s and 90s and stuff on the reading quizzes? You're just coming in and flipping a coin on the reading quizzes? You know that, if you do that, the law of averages say that you're going to end up with a 50 on reading quizzes as an average, right? Over the course of 15 reading quizzes, it's probably pretty good odds that you'll end up with about a 50 average on those reading quizzes. So, anybody remember? An authorization bill is simply a bill that gives legal authority to a program, okay? Gives legal authorization to the program, okay? But legal authority is one thing, the money to operate is another matter. And so that's the purpose of an appropriations bill. Okay, so this farm bill that we're talking about, Congress has to give it legal authority for the program to operate, but it's probably going to require the expenditure of money, so they're going to have to appropriate money for that purpose as well. So once you bring in the appropriations measures, the riders that might be attached, and all the committees and subcommittees that have to come into that, some bills may even require a revenue measure, right? Because after all, to be fiscally responsible, if you're going to spend money, you probably ought to have some way of paying for that expenditure, right? So maybe the way they're going to pay for this farm program is by an increase on the cigarette tax, right? The federal government has a cigarette tax, right? So maybe they're going to increase the cigarette tax, and now you're going to have to bring in the House Ways and Means Committee, the Tax Committee in the House of Representatives, as well as the subcommittees that are relevant, and you're going to have to bring in the Senate Finance Committee. You appreciate the point I'm trying to make to you here. Once you start adding in riders, once you start adding in appropriations measures, once you start adding in revenue bills, everything that might go into a typical piece of legislation, you might be talking about this number 13 is no longer going to cut it, right? You're talking about scores of veto points. And I don't have an exact number for you, okay? I suspect that we could model it, right? If we had the data, we could probably construct a model. My guess is it'd probably be an exponential function of some sort, right? Like, you understand what I mean by that? Like the number of committees, or excuse me, the number of veto points would go something like this as we start adding in all of those, riders and appropriations measures and tax measures and all that sort of stuff, that you have some sort of exponential function where the number of veto points just explodes, right? But conservatively, I'm going to say maybe, and please don't hang your hat on these numbers here, this range. This is a pretty big range here. I'm going to say maybe on a typical bill, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 80. On a test, you might see 50 to 60 or something like that. Just something in that range, right? Where you might have, something on the, certainly more than 13, right? Where you can have, literally scores, several dozen veto points. And maybe as many as, 80 veto points on a typical bill. And that's not even adding in the 100 veto points that we said that you could arguably add in because of each of those senators. That constitutes a veto point. Yeah?
So basically a veto point is basically like a step in the process of getting the bill. All right.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Any point along the way in this process where the bill can be effectively killed, effectively vetoed, not formally vetoed, but effectively vetoed. So this number 13, that's a minimum. I want to let's just be clear on what I'm saying here. This is an absolute minimum, okay? But you're probably, under most circumstances, talking about something like 50, 60, 70 veto points. Okay? And that's not including the 100 that we said we are overlooking on this side over here. So let's wrap up on this point, okay? So we can move on to the topic on civil rights. We only have about 3 or 4 minutes left in this class session. Here's the point I'm really trying to get across to you. Okay? There's that word fragmented Congress, or fragmentation in Congress. In a highly decentralized, fragmented Congress, with a multiplicity of decision points. Remember, we started this whole discussion of Congress, and I told you that people like Richard Fenno and other scholars who study Congress are trying to tell us most of the time we ought not think about Congress as a single point of decision authority. Instead, decision-making authority is spread out all over the place. Hey, do you all like old sayings, cliches? Have you ever heard the one that goes something like this? I always butcher these things up pretty badly. You ever heard one that goes something like, too many cooks in the kitchen spoils the soup?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard that? So you imagine like a bunch of different cooks in the kitchen, and they're all putting like, oh, it needs a little more salt. Oh, it needs a little bit more, turmeric, or it needs a little bit, and then they end up with a product that nobody likes, right? Ugh, disgusting, right? That's kind of what's happening here, right? There are so many people that have to put in their 2 cents. There's so many people that have to put in their spoon and stir the pot, right? That's exactly what Fenno and others want us to understand about Congress. In a highly decentralized, fragmented Congress with a multiplicity of decision points, legislative initiatives that are passed usually reflect an attainable consensus rather than a substantive conviction. What does those words, attainable consensus, mean? It means what we can get people to agree on. Right? Now, what gets passed in Congress usually amounts to what we can get enough people to agree on. Okay? Substantive conviction would suggest what any of those individuals really believe will work. All right? So what comes out of Congress usually reflects the art of political compromise. What we can get enough people to agree on, and not what any one of those people believe will actually work. Let's end on this point here. I want you to imagine that in the last several weeks of President Obama's administration, he doesn't have much longer in his tour of duty, right?
The conference is about to end.
You go to Washington, D.C., and you have the fortune of sitting down with the president and having a conversation. He seems like a very relatable man to me. I don't find that too far-fetched if the circumstances were just perfect that he would sit down and talk to you, right? And you ask him, Mr. Obama, your great achievement, surely you will admit your great achievement is the Affordable Care Act. I think he would say, yes, I'm worried about that with the new Republican president and the new Republican Congress. I hope that they leave that intact. Anyway, you say, Mr. President, is that the bill, the Affordable Care Act, is that the legislation that you would have written if you could have done it all on your own? I wonder what he might say. What do you think he would say? He would say absolutely not. In fact, he has as much as said that. He has said that numerous times. In fact, from the very beginning of that process back in 2010, he said, everything's on the table. In other words, he was so determined to get health care reform that he was willing to bargain and compromise. He said that going in. Now, if you were to ask all of the members of Congress who were in Congress in 2010 when that legislation was passed, Mr. Senator, Mrs. Congressman, if you could have written this legislation all by yourself, is this the legislation that you would have written? What do you think they would say? No, I would have put this in, I would have taken that out, I would have put, these things, more of this, less of that. Of course, so that's exactly what this means, right? Not one person writes the legislation. Not one person signs off on the legislation. It is the art of what is possible rather than the science of what will actually fix things.